I had a good childhood. My dad was a very indulgent man who was real good to us. I never asked for anything that I didn't get, but I was very careful. I knew not to ask for the moon, but he was real good. I took piano lessons. Edwin and Tan took piano lessons. There was not a whole lot going on. I can only remember when I was 6 or 7 years old, and I went to school in Culloden. There was a schoolhouse there. It was a 2-story building. There was a big auditorium on the back that had a stage and dressing rooms on either side. And when I was in 7th grade, I think they consolidated the school, and we were put on buses and bused to Forsyth. And I was not real happy being that far away from home. And there was not a lunchroom in the school at that time. We had to take our lunches. And I can remember taking Latin. Forget it. I did not like Latin. They had a small farm, and I did love to go to see Aunt Carrie and Uncle John, and they petted me. Edwin and Tan did not enjoy them like I did, but I enjoyed them, and I loved to play with Ollie and May. Ollie and May were the little black girls whose mother lived on the farm, and they had brothers that worked on the farm. And we fished, played in the backyard, and Aunt Carrie wanted me to come in and play the piano and talk with her, but I'd rather play with Ollie and May. And she told me on several occasions that she was going to black my face because I'd rather play with them than to play with her. Now what do you want to know? Now that I couldn't tell you, but as far as I can remember, it belonged to the Pearsons. My grandfather, great-grandfather, and I don't know who, I'd have to get the archives and go back, but I'm sure it can be traced. But I own it, you own it, and I want you to keep it. I don't think you'll ever farm there, and now they would call it a ranch. And what did they grow?
Yeah.
Oh, they grew everything. They grew everything they ate. They canned. They didn't have freezers back in the early days until after World War II. But I can remember how they canned fruits and vegetables. They dried a lot of things. They dried beans. They shelled the beans and peas, dried those. Peanuts, and the blacks called peanuts goobers. And they would put the goobers, after they were cured, dried real good, they'd put them in the oven, and a moderate oven, and cook them a little while and shake them up a couple of times. And that's what we call parched peanuts. And oh, they were good. But I enjoyed the farm. I enjoyed going to the Ichikani to fish. The Ichikani was in the backyard, and the Pearson branch was in front. And after a big rainstorm, the branch would fill up, and Aunt Carrie would take me down to the branch to fish. And I always said I was born with a fish hook in my hand. enjoyed it.
So didn't they have a dairy farm there for a while?
Yes, Uncle John Glenn had a dairy, and I can remember the milk truck coming and the noise it made with the cans bumping against each other. And the milk was shipped to Atlanta. And they had a thing in the middle of the can that held ice. But now and then, occasionally, the milk would sour. And that sour milk in those cans was returned to the farm. But I did love the farm. Edwin and Tan didn't enjoy it as much as I did. But I was the oldest, and they were Aunt Carrie and John Glenn were good to me.
Didn't they have a sugar cane mill on the farm?
There was a sugar cane mill, sugar cane. They made the syrup mill. And I did love syrup time. Oh, that was something else. And the farmers from around would bring wagon loads of sugar cane, and I can see the sugar cane hanging off the back of the wagons now. And there was a grinder out behind the old house down there, and they'd put that sugar cane between those big round things, and a horse would turn something and make those big round things turn when they stuck the cane in there. And I can see that cane juice coming out the spout. Oh my, that was happy. And then they would take the cane juice and put it in, they had a big wooden pan that was lined with copper, I think. And it had partitions between it every 10, 12 inches. And they would put that over a long pit built up high. And the men would stand over it with long handled contraptions. And as the cane juice would bubble, they would skim the bubbles off, shake it real good, and put the skimmings in a barrel, bucket or something. And it was said that some people would take those skimmings and make liquor. Now that I don't know. If they did, Aunt Carrie didn't know it, and I didn't know it. But I've heard that they did back in those days, that there were people in the community, probably blacks, that would come and get the skimmings, take them off somewhere, and whatever they did, hocus pocus, whatever, they made homemade brew.
So what was it like during the Depression living?
I'm sorry?
During the Great Depression, what was it like living down there?
I don't remember the Depression. My dad had a job. I was real lucky. Mama didn't sew. All of my clothes were bought at the best stores in Macon. And Burden Smith, Union Dry Goods, which became Macy's, and Goldman's. But Mama didn't sew. Aunt Carrie sewed when I was little. But in high school, I was best dressed. But I had a good life, really. I took piano lessons from the time Aunt Carrie was my first piano teacher. And Frances Parks, I think, was the next one. She came to Culloden. Then we went to Forsyth, and I don't remember my teachers there, but I even took piano lessons when I was in college. And until my arm was broken, my left arm was broken, I played piano. Not real well, but for my own pleasure and for my daddy.
How did you break your arm?
I was in an automobile accident, and my arm was broken, and I had to have surgery on it twice, and I still have bone screws. I think I have 8, 4 or 8.
So when you were younger, do you remember Civil War veterans? Were they around?
Yes, Mr. Askins was a Civil War veteran, but he didn't want to talk about the war. And he was an old man and didn't, it was hard to bring him out and make him talk about it. But he's about the only Civil War veteran that I remember now.
Tell me some of the stories about our family from the Civil War.
I really don't know any because my grandfather did not fight in the Civil War. He stayed home and worked for the war effort, providing food. He had a big farm, and they provided the food for the soldiers. The women knitted socks for the soldiers, I was told. Remember, I wasn't there during the Civil War, but and I don't remember a whole lot about World War II, although Johnny fought in World War II and was killed in Germany.
Tell me the story about the blanket or the quilt that was put in the tree during the Civil War.
I'm sorry?
Tell me the story about the quilt that was in
Oh, they said that the Yanks were coming through and hide all of your valuables, if you had any valuables. And nobody had a lot of silver and fine china or anything like that. But they would take what silver they had, put it in buckets, and dip it down into the well and leave it there until the Yankees left, if they came through. But everything of any value that the families had was hidden or buried to make sure the Yankees didn't get it.
What about the quilt? Wasn't it put in a tree?
Yes, and there was a quilt. I had that quilt for a while. I don't know what happened to it. Do you?
I don't know.
But there was a big stain on that quilt. And I said, that sure is an ugly stain on that quilt. Well, they hid it from the Yanks, and it rained. And they hid it in a hollow tree, and it rained. And the water was in that hollow tree, and some of it got on the quilt. But that's why there's a stain on that quilt. But it was a beautiful quilt. I don't remember what happened to it. Do we still have it?
I'm not sure. We'll have to try to find it. Probably around somewhere. So tell me about Aunt Rachel.
Oh, Aunt Rachel was a wonderful lady. She could not read or write. But she was, among the black people in the community, Aunt Rachel was the queen. She was revered by all of them. She was good. She taught us right from wrong. She was a wonderful cook. Spoiled us. And she raised 2 grandchildren, great-grandchildren, I think. Ruby, big Ruby. Ruby was big. And Boy. They were not brother and sister. They were first cousins. But Boy's mother lived in Macon, and Ruby's mother lived in Chattanooga. And I would love to go and to see Ruby, and every now and then Ruby would come down to see Aunt Rachel or come by, and we would talk. Or we'd go fishing. Mom and Daddy loved to fish. And I'd say, please go by and get Ruby. And we would always I'd take tablets and paper and all, and Ruby and I would write. Ruby didn't get to go to school much because there was no school for blacks much. There was a school for blacks in Culloden, but the weather was bad, and I don't think they had regular school. But Ruby had a beautiful handwriting, and she was smart. Her mother moved to Chattanooga, and Boy's mother lived in Macon. And I don't remember Boy's mother's name, but I did love to. We'd go, Mom and Dad would go fishing, and I'd say, go by and pick up Ruby to go and play with me. And Ruby would go, and I did enjoy Ruby. Those were good times. Schools were not consolidated when I went to school. It was all white. And I rode a school bus, and there was no lunchroom. We had to take our lunch. I'll do without, but Daddy always gave me money to buy a hamburger, and at that time you could buy a hamburger for a nickel.
Where, in Culloden?
No, I went to school. I went to high school in Forsyth, and the school bus would drive by Collins, George Collins, had a tiny little hamburger stand. I think it had been the back of a freight car or something on a train, on a railroad. And he made hamburgers. And the school bus would stop by that place in the afternoon after school. And when I went to school in Forsyth, there was not a lunchroom. You either took your lunch or waited until you got home at 3 o'clock and raided the kitchen. But after I graduated from high school, they had all the schools in Georgia had lunchrooms. But I was not one of those fortunate ones. I was fortunate because my dad had a job, and I took nice lunches. Mama made me very nice lunches. I had a lunch box for the thermos, and I had sandwiches and always cookies or some kind of dessert. And then they had started having lunchrooms the last 2 years, and I can't remember. They were sandwiches and things like that. Later they had a nice lunch, but when I was in high school, the first years there was not a lunchroom.
Tell me a little bit about downtown Culloden and the train that used to go through there. The train that used to go through Culloden.
Oh yes, there was a train that went through Culloden, and I would ride the train to visit Aunt Ada and Uncle George, Francis, and Florence. And it went close by their house. And I would get off the train, and they would all be there to meet me. And Mom and Daddy would come on Sunday afternoon and pick me up and take me home. But those were happy, happy memories then. But I can remember when the train went through Culloden, and a lot of people would go up at night and watch the train as it came in. People had been to Atlanta to shop. They'd get off the train. But Mom and Daddy never did that. They didn't think that was good sport, and they didn't think that was... I always wished I could, but we didn't live close to the train and station. And then they took the train away, and they had a bus that went through Culloden, but I never rode the bus.
Why did they take the train away?
I don't know. It was Southern Railway, and it went from Fort Valley to Atlanta. And I can remember riding the train to Atlanta and getting off the train at the old railroad station and walking across to Rich's, old Rich's downtown. And then you'd walk about 4 blocks up to Davison-Paxson, which became Macy's. And get on the train, ride back to Culloden. Those were the days.
Tell me a little bit about your parents. Tell me about your parents, your mom and dad.
About what?
Your mom and dad.
Well, what do you want to know? Daddy was, my dad had a job. I grew up during the Depression, and strangely enough, I was the best dressed in my high school. Although there were 2 or 3 girls whose fathers were multimillionaires. If they were not multimillionaires, they were pretty close to it. But I was the best dressed in my high school class. And I was not the best student. I was not a real good student. But I think I did okay.
So what kind of job did your dad have?
My dad worked for the government. And he was real lucky. He was a rural mail carrier. And don't confuse that with being a postman. But he had at one time, I think it was, if not the longest mail route in Georgia, it was close to it. But he had wonderful patrons on his route. And at Christmas time, oh my goodness, they loaded him up. The ladies would bake cakes and pies and cookies and all kinds of goodies because he would run little errands for them. They lived out in the country. A lot of them didn't have automobiles. And they would ask Daddy to go by and buy a pound of cheese or apples, oranges, or whatever. And Daddy would run all kinds of errands for them. And oh my goodness, did they ever reward him. Our back porch was always full of watermelons and vegetables of all kinds. And during World War II and after World War II, we had one of the first freezers in the county. And it was a big, long freezer, and it was full of vegetables, frozen fruits, chicken. And then later, and during World War II, everybody did their part. And Daddy started raising calves and cows and pigs. And our freezer was chock full of beef and pork, sausage, chicken, all of it. And my friends in high school, they'd love to go to Culloden. They did love to go, and they were really privileged to spend a weekend or just spend the night. And Mama did not encourage me to bring friends home at night. She did not like that. But every now and then, I can remember one time this girl came running up to me. I had just gotten to school and I was walking in to the schoolyard, and this girl ran up to me. Guess what? I brought my clothes. I'm going to spend the night with you tonight. Oh, Lord, Mama's going to kill me. But she didn't. She was nice. And we had a nice weekend. But I was encouraged. I don't know how I discouraged future people, but I didn't have many overnight guests after that. Overnight guests after that.
Tell me about the house that was next door to your parents, to your house where you grew up.
Miss White.
Yeah, Miss White's house.
Miss Tommy White was a school teacher. She had taught in a one-room schoolhouse. She did not go to college. I don't think she ever graduated from high school. She was well read, and I would, after I went to school in Forsyth, I would check books out at the library, and I would take armloads of books home every week, and I would march over to Miss White's house, and she read all those books, and I would go and sit on her doorsteps, and we would discuss the books that we had read. And Jimmy Wilson lived up the road from us, and finally his mother moved across the road from us. She rented that house, and Jimmy was 3 weeks older than me, and we would go to Miss White's in the afternoon, and she did not take a newspaper. Miss White was a widow, and my dad took care of her. My dad had been raised on a farm, and he always had a big garden, several big gardens. In fact, he bought all the land our house was on. He'd buy a few acres here and there and a few there. She didn't sell it all at once, which was smart. But whenever she needed money, she'd tell Daddy she was going to sell some land. And Dad would say, "Miss Tommy, what do you want for that land?" "Well, I don't know exactly what it's worth, but I'm going to have to sell some." And Daddy says, "Well, I will investigate, but I want you to investigate too. I don't want anybody to ever say that I cheated you." And she always told me and Edwin and Tan that my dad was the most honest man she had ever known. And Daddy always had a garden. He had been raised on a farm. And during World War II, everybody did their part. Oh my goodness. Food was canned, dried. They dried peaches. I can remember drying peaches and having big bags of dried peaches, and they'd put them out in the sun. The bags were cotton flour sacks that had been washed and washed and washed and washed until they were really thin and soft. And they would fill them with dried peaches. And I can remember big boards, and they would put old sheets or something over them and put those sliced peaches on there and put them out in the sun, and they would dry. But they put them out every time the sun would come out, you know, they put those peaches out to dry. When they got dry enough, they would put them in cotton flour sacks. Flour came in cotton bags, and those bags were washed and washed and washed until they were real thin. And that's what they put those flowers. They put the peaches in those flour sacks. And on pretty sunny days, hot days, they put those sacks out in the sun, and somebody would go out and turn those sacks, shake them up and dry them. And then they would, one day Mama would say, "Well, we're going to have peach puffs today." And Aunt Rachel, who was our cook, she'd go out and get a bag of those dried peaches. No, they had to do it the day before. She'd take some of the dried peaches, put them in water, and soak them. I don't know whether they soaked them for a few hours or overnight. And then the next day they were boiled, and with a little water, and they'd put sugar on them, and then they would make peach puffs. They'd take a piece of pastry and roll it out real, real thin, and put those sweetened peaches with butter. And fold that piece of pastry over, take a fork and go all around the edges. And those were called peach puffs. They did apples that way too. Oh, I did love to come home from school and go to the kitchen and find a big platter with peach puffs in it. Oh, heaven.
When did you move away from Culloden? When did you move away from Culloden?
Well, when I went to college, I went to college at Middle Georgia, and I went home. I was not a happy camper. I was happy to go home. And then when I married and moved away, but I always liked to go back to Culloden, and we still own that land, and I want you to own that land always. So you and Alice and my grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and great-greats. It's always a place of refuge. That and the Ichikani.
Now, when you got married, when did you get married and where did you move?
I married when I was 19, I think. And I married Johnny. And Johnny was from Puerto Rico. And we were secretly married. I was afraid to tell my daddy. But finally one day, Johnny told his mom and dad. And they said, well, you better bring her to Puerto Rico. Let her see us. Let us get to know her. And I went, and they thought, well, hey, she's not going to like it there, and she'll be back home soon. Well, guess what? I fell in love with them. I fell in love with Puerto Rico. And I'd go back tomorrow. I loved it. I enjoyed the food, the climate, and Tita Peppa and Tita Concha's house was a half block from the ocean, and Mommy and Papa's house was a couple of blocks from the ocean. I didn't get to go very often because they didn't want me to go. But I did love it, and I had a good life, and I wouldn't take anything in the world for it because I had a touch of the European way of living. I was more fortunate than most of the people that lived in Culloden, that some of them are better educated than me in some ways.
Now, how long did you live in Puerto Rico?
Oh, I kept going back. I'd go. I wasn't a happy camper at first. I missed Mom and Daddy. I loved home. But I'd go home and stay a few weeks, and I was ready to go back. I liked the food. I liked the people. I married into the best family there. They were the most wonderful people. They were Catholic. And nobody in my family had ever even known a Catholic, I don't think. But I became a Catholic, and I'm glad.
Where in Puerto Rico did they live?
Tita Peppa and Tita Concha and their mother lived 2 blocks from the ocean, and Mommy and Papa's house was 3 or 4 blocks from the ocean.
Do you remember what town or city? Do you remember what town or city?
Mommy and Papa lived in Santurce, which was the best part of Puerto Rico, San Juan, I'll say, and I loved it. I got right in there with them. I had studied Spanish in college. I understood Spanish, and I spoke kitchen Spanish. But with a southern accent, forget it. They'd laugh at my Spanish, or they'd smile, and I could tell that I just could not roll those R's. But I loved it, I loved the people, and I loved the food.
How did Johnny end up in Culloden?
Johnny didn't end up in Culloden exactly, but his family sent him to high school at Gordon Military Academy. And I met him, and he had dated. I met him through a friend named Millicent Lunsford, who was beautiful. She was a year or two older than me, and Johnny was her boyfriend. And I met Johnny, and that was it. He was the most handsome guy I ever knew. And we were married, and it was good until he got killed in Germany.
He was friends with the people that lived in the big plantation house not far from your house, right?
I'm sorry?
He was friends with the people that lived in the big plantation house?
Oh, yeah, the Stalkers. Yeah. The Stalkers were, the Rutherford place was a big plantation. It had been abandoned for many years. And Mr. Stalker's mother, I think, was born in Culloden. I'm not real sure. But he moved off to St. Louis. And he married, I think his first wife was from Spain. And he had 2 children, Tommy and Mignonette. Mignonette was old, well, they were both older than me. Tommy became good friends with Johnny, my first husband. And Tommy and Mignonette spoke. Mr. Stalker was, I think he worked for for Ford, or he worked for an automobile manufacturer. But he and Mrs. Stalker was from St. Louis, Missouri. She was his second wife. His first wife was Mexican, I think. And she was the mother of Tommy and Mignonette. And Tommy and Mignonette lived in St. Louis. Mr. Stalker and Mrs. Stalker. The second Mrs. Stalker was also from St. Louis. But they bought the old Rutherford plantation near Culloden. And Tommy and Johnny, my first husband, became very good friends. And I can remember Tommy would ride horseback up to Culloden, and he and Johnny became good friends. And Johnny loved to go visit Tommy because he could ride horseback, and they'd come up to see me. And it was about 4, 5, 6 miles, maybe further, I don't know. But Mr. Stalker bought the old Rutherford plantation and remodeled the old 2-story house, and I did love to go down there. The second Mrs. Stalker was from St. Louis, and she was a very lovely, well-educated lady, and how she ever managed to live in Culloden as long as she did, I'll never know. But she was Tommy and Mignonette's stepmother. Their mother, it was said, was Mexican, I don't know. But they said she was from a very good Mexican family. And Tommy and Johnny, my first husband, became very good friends. And but I did love to go down to the Stalker place. It was the old Rutherford plantation, and Mr. Stalker bought it. His second wife, was from St. Louis, and she was Tommy and Mignonette's stepmother, and she was a lovely, cultured lady, more cultured than anybody from Culloden ever was.
Now, when did Johnny, in World War II, when did he leave? Johnny, when did he leave for World War II, and what did he do, and where did you stay while he was gone?
You're going to have to repeat all that.
When Johnny went in World War II to Germany, what did he do there, and where were you during
Well, he was a lieutenant, and he got promoted, And just before he died, was about to be promoted to captain. I don't know what he did. He was in the infantry. I can't remember now what he did, but he was the best looking man I ever saw. He was the best looking man that ever walked through Culloden. And he had wonderful parents, and Titi Pepper and Titi Concha were his spinster aunts. I attracted men who had spinster aunts, and I had spinster aunts.
When he was in the war, where did you stay?
Johnny was an officer. He was a second lieutenant, first lieutenant, had been promoted to captain when he got killed. He was in Germany. Can't remember where in Germany now, but you might find some records in Culloden among some of my papers somewhere. But he was the best looking man I ever saw. He looked like Errol Flynn. Now you don't know who Errol Flynn was, but if you ever see any old movies, he was a handsome movie actor, and Johnny looked like him. And you talk about jealous. I could not stand for another woman to look at him. And I made up my mind, don't ever marry another handsome man. But women everywhere looked at him. Whew, he sure is good looking. And he was. But he was a good guy. And I married into a good family. He had 2 old maid aunts, and they were wonderful. And Mommy and Poppy were wonderful. They were well-educated people. My parents were not college educated, but they were good, smart people. But Johnny's family were college educated, and they had traveled abroad, and Mom and Daddy had never been any further than Atlanta, I don't think. Oh, Mama, I'm sorry, Mama had a half-sister who lived in Ohio, and I think she went up to visit her once. But other than that, they were native Middle Georgians.
When did you find out that Johnny died, and what happened after that?
Well, I got a telegram from the War Department saying that I think he was a first lieutenant, or was he a captain? He was to be promoted, or already promoted, but I think he was a first lieutenant, that he had been killed in Germany. And I wouldn't believe it. I said, nah, not Johnny. But he was the most handsome man I ever met.
When did you move to Atlanta? It was after that?
Oh, yeah. And I bought a house. I saved my money. I lived in Culloden and saved my money. And I think I finally had $5,000. And I bought a house in College Park on Main Street. It was a big 2-story house in terrible repair. And I rented one. It had been divided into 4 apartments. And I rented one of the apartments to Uncle George's niece and her husband with the understanding that they could live there in an upstairs 4-room house, 4-room apartment. But he would have to take care of the yard. And I didn't have a car, but he had a car. And we would go to the grocery store on Friday afternoon. Of course, now it was in walking distance of the grocery stores. If I needed anything, I could always walk or take a taxi. And it was in College Park, and could send Rod to Georgia Military Academy. He could ride his bicycle 3 or 4 blocks to school. And on rainy days, I could pay for a taxi to take him to school. But it was a good life. It was a good neighborhood then. I don't know what it's like now. And I was able to sell that old house to American Oil. You talk about luck. Somebody upstairs.
And where did you move after that?
I bought a house on Timothy. And I lived there. Huh?
What about the house on Roxbury?
I finally sold that to American Oil. And that's when I got well. And if I had had anybody to advise me, I probably could have done a lot better. But I did well, and I have no regrets, except I wish that I'd had somebody to advise me. But I bought property, and I bought a house that had apartments. And then I bought another house and kept that house and finally sold it to American Oil. Wish I'd kept it. But I didn't have, my dad had died by that time, and I didn't have anybody to advise me. But if I had been real smart, and if I had had somebody to advise me, I would have leased it to American Oil, and I would still have a lease, and you would have a lease. But I didn't have anybody to advise me. So my advice to you, if you ever have a friend that is in a position like I was in, don't hesitate to offer your advice, good or bad. It's up to that person to take your advice. But always ask not 1, 2, but 3 people, and then use your own judgment. But I wish now that I had kept some kind of a lease on that property. But I sold it to American Oil, and I did okay. But if I had been real smart, I would have leased it, and you would be well fixed today.
So Uncle Rod was very young at this time, correct?
Was what?
When was Uncle Rod born?
Where was he born?
He was born in Culloden, right?
Macon.
And while Johnny was when Johnny was away during the war?
Yeah. And Johnny got killed in Germany when Rod was about 2 years old, 2.5 years old, I think. And
and then you took him to Atlanta to College Park.
Yeah.
Now, when did you meet Fred?
When did I meet Fred? Goodness, it's been so long, Miles. I'm having a hard time remembering.
In Atlanta, though?
Oh, yeah. I'm getting Fred's family and Johnny's family confused. I attracted men who had spinster aunts. That's why. But Titi Peppa and Titi Concha were Johnny's aunts. And they were wonderful ladies. Oh, they had traveled all over Europe, South America. They were wonderful ladies. And Johnny's Fred's aunts, was Ruth. And she was a legal secretary. And she was a smart cookie. But she took care of Papa Pete and his second wife, really. And there was Papa Pete and Corinne were divorced. Corinne was his first wife. And I didn't know Corinne until after Papa Pete died, I think. But I fell in love with her. She was a lovely lady. And I don't remember ever seeing his second wife again after he died. Her name was Jessie. But I love Papa Pete. He was wonderful. Oh, he was a good man.
What was Fred like? What was Fred like?
What was Fred like?
Yeah.
Fred had been raised by spinster aunts. I attracted men that had old maid aunts for some reason. But Fred was a good man. He was honest. He was a good Christian. And but he could not handle money. If he had a nickel, he was going to spend it. And 90% of the time, 95% of the time, he'd spend it on me. And I said, Fred, you can't do that. But I wanted you to have this, I wanted you to have that. And I had to watch him, and I had to make sure that he didn't charge something that I'd have to pay for, or we'd have to pay for later, and I didn't want that to happen, you know. But he had been overindulged by 2 old maid aunts. But he was a good guy.
What do you know about his time? He was in World War II.
I'm sorry?
He was in World War II, in the Marine Corps. What do you know about that?
I don't know much. I can't remember much about it. I know he was an ex-Marine, and he was devoted to the Marines, although afterwards, I don't know why he switched. I think it had to do with his age, maybe. I'm not sure. But Fred was a good guy.
And when was Dad born?
I'm sorry?
Tell me about when Dad was born.
Gosh, Mara. Where was he born? In
Atlanta.
I know Mama came to live with us, and Mama took over because my dad had died. And Mama could not keep her hands off Rod or Eddie. Oh my, she always wanted a boy. And Ken would not let Mama touch him. He was always, he'd kick, he wouldn't let Edwina hold him. But Eddie and Rod loved it, and I never got to hold them. Mama was always there. And Mama would wake up in the morning, and she'd wake them up and dress them and feed them, and she always wanted a boy. And she had Rod and Eddie, and she really did enjoy it. They were the apples of her eye.
Now, Aunt Beanie and Uncle Murphy also lived in Atlanta, correct?
What?
At that time, Aunt Beanie and Uncle Murphy also lived in Atlanta, correct?
Yeah, but they didn't live with us.
Where did they live?
Well, Murphy was a veterinarian, and they bought a house. Well, they first lived in Buckhead. I can't remember the name of the street now. But I could find it. And then they bought the house on Moores Mill Road. And Murphy and Edwina had the Banks Animal Clinic, and Edwina went with Murphy every morning and opened that Murphy knew it was going to be a good day when he heard that door open and Edwina's footsteps there. But she kept the books. She was there. And you either paid cash or you were a good patron, whatever they called them. And Murphy was a very well-known and respected veterinarian. He should have been a doctor of medicine. But he was a good guy, and Lisa and Ken were good too.
Now, you guys, did you ever used to go to Underground Atlanta? What was Atlanta like back then?
I'm sorry?
Did you ever used to go to Underground Atlanta with them? What was Atlanta like back then?
Oh, loved Underground. Every Saturday night, sometimes on Friday night, we'd go to Underground. And there was, oh, what was the name of that place that we went to? And it grew. And our table was over sort of in a corner, and that table grew and grew and grew. And the Rosebuds were the musical group there. And Uncle Murphy would, oh, he would open his pockets up. And Edwina was mad with him. Oh, Murphy, put that money back in your pocket. You can't afford that. He took care of the Rosebuds. And when they saw Dr. Banks come in, oh, and they play special songs for Dr. Banks. We had a special table, and that table grew and grew and grew. I wonder what Underground would be like now. I'm sure it would not be safe. I'm sure it would be different. What is this?
That's the microphone for the camera. It picks up what you're saying and it puts it to the camera.
You're not taping it, I hope.
A little bit.
Oh, my.
Now, tell me about, do you remember the gunfight Uncle Murphy got in at Peachtree Battle?
I'm sorry.
Do you remember when Uncle Murphy got in a gunfight at Peachtree Battle Shopping Center?
I've forgotten all about that. I think I was there, wasn't I?
I don't know. Tell me the story.
I think I was. We went to eat at, I can't remember the name of that place. And we had eaten, and we would always, we'd get out and walk down the street, and there were a lot of people we would meet and eat with and talk with. And we were standing out on the street in front of this restaurant. And Murphy always carried a gun. You'd say, Murphy, we'd go to Underground Atlanta, which was not the safest place. But we had an entourage that would go every Friday or Saturday night to Underground. And what was the name of that place? There was one special place we went to. I would say, but Murphy always carried his gun. He had a permit because he would go down to the hospital at night late to check on his hospital. And he always carried that gun on his hip. He was something else. Murphy was a good guy. A bit henpecked, but don't tell Edwina I said so. But he was a good guy, and Lisa and Ken were good too.
What happened at that gunfight at Peachtree Battle Shopping Center?
I can't remember a whole lot about it, Miles. But I know that Murphy had his gun and he pulled it out, and he sort of got in a little trouble with it. I would have gotten in a little trouble with it. But Murphy, everywhere Murphy went, he carried his gun. You always knew that you were safe when Murphy was around because he carried that gun. And the reason he carried the gun was because he would go to the hospital to check on the hospital and the animals late at night. And he had a lot of drugs there, of course, and it would not have been safe for him to go without a gun, so he always carried a gun. And I know.
Tell me a little bit about the house on Timothy.
About what?
The house on Timothy, and Dad going to high school while he lived there.
Oh my goodness, Miles. Wish I had a picture of it. I could remember a little bit more. I can't remember a whole lot about Timothy. I can't remember much about it.
Well, that's where Dad grew up, in that house.
Yeah.
And then, do you remember when he met Mom and I was born?
Remember what?
When he met Mom, Alice, and I was born after that.
You know, I can remember things that happened a long time ago a lot better than I can things that happened more recent. But I can remember you. Oh, you were the apple of my eye, really. How wonderful.
Tell me a little bit about John Glenn. I know you talked about him a lot.
John Glenn was Daddy's brother. Daddy had one sister and one brother, Aunt Carrie and John Glenn. Aunt Carrie never married, and John Glenn never married. John Glenn would have married because girls were crazy about him in his younger days. But every time he had a serious relationship, Aunt Carrie there was something wrong with that family. Somebody in that family was something. She deep six any relationship that poor man ever had. I don't know how my daddy escaped. But Aunt Carrie was a wonderful lady, and John Glenn was good. Every now and then, John Glenn would, about once or twice a year, he'd go on a weekend binge. He'd drink a little bit too much. If he'd had two, it was too much. But he was a good guy, and I loved him. I loved both of them. Aunt Carrie sewed. She took in what they called took in. She sewed for people, and she would charge for making a dress or something for a while. And then after a while, people bought their clothes already made. But a lot of times a lot of people would buy a dress at a big store, and it wouldn't be too big in the waist or too long, and it would have to be altered, and they would go to Aunt Carrie, and Aunt Carrie would she was a good seamstress. But Aunt Carrie was good. She was real sweet, and John Glenn would have married, but every girlfriend he had, Aunt Carrie was careful to deep six that relationship. Poor Uncle John. But he was a good guy. Every now and then he'd go on a tear, and Aunt Carrie would get somebody to come and get Daddy, and Daddy would go get John and bring him home. She wouldn't speak to him for several days or a week, but he was a good guy. And he would have married, but every time he found a girl, there was something wrong with that family. You don't want to get messed up with those people. Ooh, I don't like them. We don't have anything to do with those people. Oh, poor Uncle John.
Tell me about the judge's house across the street. The judge's house across the street from your house?
Judge Oliver Cleveland. He was deaf as a post. And he talked real loud, and he carried a cane, and he had, trying to think, he had a son. Seems like he had a son that was killed in World War II. We'd have to go to the Pearson Cemetery and let me renew that memory. But Susie Cleveland married Daddy's second cousin. Daddy didn't have any first cousins, I don't think. Not Pearson's. He had some on the Edwards side, maybe. Yeah, because Preston Edwards was the first cousin. But what was the question?
I was asking you about the judge's house across the street.
Oh. Well, Judge Oliver Cleveland was deaf as a post, and he talked real loud. And trying to remember, his oldest daughter, Susie, married Wes Pearson, who was Daddy's second or third cousin. And Cousin Wes bought the place from Susie's sisters. And Cousin Wes had a half-sister and another sister, Jerry. Jerry was had some learning disabilities. She was not quite normal. She never married. She never went to school, I don't think. But she was, we always referred to her as Little Sister. She was an old woman. She was older than Daddy. But they treated, and he married Susie Cleveland. They never had children. But he told her that he would marry her. He loved her, and he'd love to marry her. But he had a mother and a little sister. And that little sister was older than he was. And he says, and I have to take care of them. But I love you, and I would marry you, but you'd have to understand that my mother and little sister will have to live with us. And she says, well, I love you, and I'll take care of them. So they got married, and they never had children. But he took care of his mother and Jerry. And Jerry had some learning disabilities. They said she was injured at birth. Back in those days, they didn't always have hospitals and doctors and all. And a lot of times when a baby was born, something happened, and evidently that's what happened to Jerry. But Cousin Wes was a good businessman, and he married Susie Cleveland, and her daddy was Judge Oliver Cleveland. He was deaf as a post.
Now, you used to tell me when I was little, you used to tell me a story about one of the Pearsons coming back from the Civil War, and his brothers and sisters went down to the creek and gave him a bath, got him all cleaned up, and he died shortly after.
Wait a minute.
You told me a story about one of the Pearsons coming back from the Civil War in Culloden, and his brothers and sisters kind of cleaned him up for their mom. Do you remember that story? And he died shortly after, I think.
Yeah.
Who was that?
Oh, I wish you had asked me that 10 years before and recorded it. I'd have to get the archives. We have to go to the next Pearson reunion. But what was his name? John, I think his name was John something. And he came back from the Civil War. He didn't live long. Edwards? He didn't live long afterwards. He had endured many hardships. They came back, they were not well clothed. They nearly froze to death. Their shoes were worn out. They came back barefoot from the Civil War. Oh, must have been a horrible, horrible time. And they thought he was dead. See, there was no way to communicate except through the mail. And the Confederate soldiers didn't have a stamp. A lot of times, mothers and grandmothers, grandparents and all, would think they were dead. They're probably dead. We hadn't heard from them for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. And then one day they would show up on the steps or something. A lot of them had been held in captivity in Union prisons. I can't remember offhand any now. I wish I had a way to record Aunt Carrie's stories. She could tell some good ones. But my grandfather did not fight in the Civil War, but my great-grandfather did, I think. My dad was in the Army, and there used to be some pictures of Daddy in his uniform, and I can remember parts of his uniform being in Culloden. I'm sure they've been thrown away.
Where's he from, your dad? Culloden?
Where was he from?
Culloden, right?
He was born out at the farm that you still own today, I hope.
We do.
You hang on to it. They're not making any more Itchicony acres. Don't you ever forget that. They sweated blood over that land, and the Pearson Cemetery is there, and there's a lot of history there. And I would love to go to the next Pearson reunion and take you and Alice and all of us go, and that's quite a story. Not many people have a history like that. And as far as I know, none of them have ever been arrested or put in jail.
That's good.
Huh?
That's good.
That's good.
Can you think of anything else you want to tell me before I turn the camera off, or tell?
I can't think of anything, but if you think of anything later, we'll
I'll turn it back
add
on.
to it.
All right.
But they were good people. How old is she now?
She's 4 months old. Let's go see Great-Grandma. Let's see Great-Grandma.
Oh, you pretty girl. Hey. Pretty girl. Yeah. Do you have a Patsy? Uh-oh. No primping. No primping. No primping, okay?
Good girl.
You got a scratch on your nose.
Yeah, she scratched her nose.
Let me see that little hand.
All right, so just tell me a little bit about life in Culloden growing up.
Starting when?
Starting when you were born.
Well, I don't remember that, but I